Major General Ava Sinclair felt the handcuffs bite into her wrists as Officer Travis Langford slammed her against the hood of his patrol car in front of Mercy Baptist Church in Millbrook, Georgia. Her mother's funeral had ended only moments earlier. Mourners held their breath from the church steps. Her full military dress uniform, adorned with ribbons and 3 silver stars, meant nothing to Langford. He saw only a black woman he assumed was trespassing on private property. What he did not know was that Joint Base Andrews had already been notified. Federal response protocols were activating. Ava tried to explain that she was burying her mother, but Langford refused to listen. His hand pressed hard against her back, pinning her against the scorching metal of the patrol car while he radioed for backup. The August sun in Georgia beat down on both of them, yet Ava's mind remained ice-cold, calculating every word, every movement. She had commanded thousands of airmen in combat zones, negotiated with foreign military leaders, and briefed the president. Yet here she stood, helpless before a small-town police officer who would not even look at her identification. Langford accused her of stealing the uniform and playing dress-up. His voice dripped with contempt as he told her that women like her did not become generals. Ava's Aunt Celeste, an elderly woman, ran from the church steps, her black funeral dress billowing behind her, holding out a phone with photographs of Ava's promotion ceremony. The images showed Ava standing beside the Secretary of the Air Force as she received her 3rd star. Langford barely glanced at the screen before threatening to arrest Aunt Celeste as well for obstruction of justice. The funeral director, a dignified man named Vernon Hayes who had served Millbrook's black community for decades, approached cautiously with his hands raised. He explained that he had known Ava since she was a child, that her mother, Lauren Sinclair, had been a beloved teacher in this town, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Langford called him a liar and ordered him back inside the church. Ava remained calm, drawing on every hour of military training that had taught her discipline under pressure, knowing that any reaction, any sharp word or sudden movement, would be twisted into resistance, into justification for violence. She spoke slowly and clearly, asking Langford simply to verify her identity through military channels, to call the base and confirm her credentials. He laughed in her face, called for backup again, this time telling dispatch that he had a suspicious black woman impersonating a military officer, possibly mentally unstable, possibly dangerous. 2 more. Millbrook police patrol cars arrived within minutes, sirens wailing unnecessarily through the quiet neighborhood. Officers Kyle Hendricks and Travis Morton stepped out of their vehicles, both young, both white, both smiling as if they had been summoned to the most entertaining event of their week. The 3 officers mocked her uniform, Hendricks asking if she had bought it at a costume shop, Morton wondering aloud how much stolen valor paid on the black market these days. Ava noticed that several mourners were already recording on their phones, including her cousin Julian, a technology journalist who worked for a digital outlet in Atlanta. She caught his eye for an instant, seeing the fury and helplessness on his face, but also the determination as he angled his phone to capture everything. Langford searched her roughly, his hands invasive and deliberate, lingering longer than necessary as he checked her uniform jacket and emptied her pockets. He found her military identification card with her photograph, rank, and clearance level clearly visible. He found her Pentagon building access card with embedded security chips. He found her military driver's license with her address at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. He dismissed them all as fake identifications anyone could buy online for $50, telling the other officers that criminals were getting smarter with their forgeries lately. Hendricks suggested adding identity theft charges. Morton agreed enthusiastically. They forced Ava into the back of the patrol car, pushing her head down roughly as they shoved her into the seat. The car smelled of sweat and stale fast food. Ava sat upright, her posture perfect despite the handcuffs, staring straight ahead as Langford drove away from the church, away from her mother's funeral, away from the family who had traveled from across the country to say goodbye to a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children to read. As Langford turned onto Main Street toward the station, 3 blocks away, Ava's cousin Julian uploaded the arrest video to social media with a caption that included Ava's full rank, her position as Deputy Commander of Air Combat Command, and the fact that she had been arrested at her own mother's funeral. Within minutes, the video had tens of thousands of views as it spread through military networks, veterans groups, and news aggregators. In less than 10 minutes, it reached someone at the Pentagon, a junior officer in the Air Force Public Affairs Office, who immediately elevated it to his commanding officer, who called the Secretary of the Air Force's office, who contacted the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, setting in motion a response that would shake the foundations of Millbrook. At the Millbrook Police Department, a deteriorating brick building with peeling paint and barred windows, Ava was processed like a common criminal, while Langford was celebrated by his colleagues for what they called a major bust. Desk Sergeant Helen Torres, a heavy-set white woman in her 50s who had worked the front desk for decades, took Ava's fingerprints and photographs, treating her with cold efficiency and barely concealed disgust. Ava again requested that they verify her identity through military channels, providing specific numbers for Air Combat Command Headquarters, the Pentagon, and her direct commanding officer. Torres wrote nothing down and told her that people who steal military uniforms do not get special phone calls. Ava was led down a dim hallway past cells and interrogation rooms to where Police Chief Raymond Briggs waited in his office. Briggs was a broad-chested man with a graying military haircut and eyes that had regarded Millbrook's black residents with suspicion throughout his entire career. The walls of his office displayed local civic awards, photographs with state politicians, and a framed newspaper article from years earlier celebrating his appointment as chief. What the walls did not show were the 17 pending civil rights complaints filed against his department by black residents. Complaints that sat in boxes in the county prosecutor's office, uninvestigated and forgotten. He looked at Ava standing before him in her uniform without the jacket Langford had seized as evidence and let out a deep belly laugh that shook his entire frame. He told her she had put on quite an elaborate performance, that it was a very impressive costume for a welfare queen, and that she should have chosen a lower rank because 3-star generals did not show up in towns like Millbrook. He listed her charges with obvious satisfaction, speaking slowly so she would understand the gravity of her situation. Impersonating a military officer, trespassing on church property, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. Each charge carried possible prison time, fines, and a permanent criminal record. Ava maintained her composure and once more requested legal counsel and military notification, rights she knew she possessed regardless of the charges. Briggs denied both requests, stating she would receive her phone call after processing was complete, which could take several hours given how backed up they were that day. He ordered Torres to place Ava in a cell with the other detainees. They stripped her of the uniform jacket completely, now taking her ribbons and stars as evidence of her alleged crime, leaving her only in uniform trousers and a white undershirt. Ava was taken to a cell where 2 other black women sat on a concrete bench, both arrested that same morning for minor infractions. One of them, elderly and dignified despite her circumstances, looked at Ava for a long moment before recognition flooded her face. Her name was Dorothy Cho, a retired postal worker who remembered reading an article months earlier about Ava's promotion to Major General, a story that had appeared in the Atlanta Constitution about a Millbrook native who had risen to become one of the highest-ranking black women in the history of the United States military. Dorothy tried to speak to Sergeant Torres, tried to explain that this woman was exactly who she claimed to be, but Torres threatened her with additional charges for creating a disturbance. The other woman in the cell, younger, perhaps in her 30s, arrested for a broken taillight that had escalated into a full vehicle search, remained silent, yet her eyes showed she understood that something terrible was happening. Briggs returned to his office and called Officer Langford in for a private meeting. He congratulated Langford on his vigilance, on his dedication to protecting the community from criminals who would dare mock the military with fake uniforms. He told him he was drafting a recommendation, possibly a bonus, and certainly recognition at the next city council meeting. Langford smiled with pride, already imagining how he would tell this story to his friends, how he had caught someone attempting an elaborate scam. They denied Ava her legally guaranteed phone call. Briggs claimed the telephone system was down and would not be repaired until the following morning at the earliest. In reality, every phone worked perfectly. In Washington, D.C., more than 500 miles away, General Thomas Reeves, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, received an urgent alert on his secure phone during an afternoon meeting with defense contractors. His aide, a young Army captain, interrupted him despite strict instructions never to disturb him during acquisition meetings. The captain's face was pale as he showed Reeves his tablet with the viral video, which now had millions of views and was still climbing. The video showed everything with total clarity. Footage captured by Julian's phone of a black woman in Air Force dress uniform being slammed against a patrol car, searched brutally, and arrested while funeral attendees watched in horror. Reeves recognized Ava immediately. He had worked with her on 3 separate operations, trusted her judgment absolutely, and had personally recommended her for her current position. His face went pale as anger and disbelief warred inside him. He made 3 calls at once. The first was to the Secretary of Defense, who was attending a NATO conference in Brussels, but answered instantly when he heard the urgency in Reeves's voice. The second was to the Attorney General of the United States, activating federal civil rights investigation protocols. The third was to the Commander of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, ordering an immediate deployment to Millbrook, Georgia. Then he instructed his aide to get the FBI director on a secure line and to notify the White House Chief of Staff that a situation had developed requiring immediate executive attention. Reeves's final instruction was clear and forceful. "This stops now. Get me every resource we have and someone find out exactly what kind of police department we are dealing with in Millbrook." Ava remained seated in the cell, while Millbrook's power structure mobilized to protect itself from what they still believed was simply an internet controversy that would disappear by morning. Chief Briggs called Mayor Gerald Holt, who also served as county commissioner, a dual role that concentrated unusual power in his hands. Holt had controlled Millbrook for more than 2 decades through a combination of old money, political connections, and a willingness to use fear and intimidation against anyone who challenged his authority. The town's demographics told part of the story. 72% white, 25% black, 3% other. Geographic divisions were so clear they might as well have been drawn with permanent marker. The east side, where Mercy Baptist Church stood, housed most of the black community in modest homes built in the 1950s and 1960s. The west side and downtown belonged predominantly to white families with newer construction, better schools, and police protection rather than police harassment. Holt had built his political career on law and order rhetoric that everyone understood meant keeping the black community under control, keeping it quiet, keeping it in its place. He met with Briggs within the first hour of Ava's arrest, also summoning the town attorney, Jessica Chambers, and 3 council members whose loyalty he had purchased through patronage and mutual corruption. They gathered in Holt's office at City Hall, a renovated antebellum mansion that served as both historic monument and seat of power. Chambers, a sharp woman in her early 40s who had graduated from the University of Georgia School of Law and returned to Millbrook despite better opportunities elsewhere, projected the viral video onto the large screen in Holt's office. They watched in silence as Ava was arrested, as Langford mocked her uniform, as the entire shameful scene unfolded in high definition. The view count now stood at 5 million and was still rising. National media had already picked up the story. Cable news channels were opening their broadcasts with the case. Hashtags were beginning to trend across social media. Chambers, whose legal training told her this was a disaster, warned them that the situation could be extraordinarily serious, that federal civil rights statutes were clear, and that assaulting and falsely arresting a military officer created multiple layers of criminal and civil liability. Holt dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand that suggested he had faced and overcome far worse controversies during his time in power. He told the assembled group that the internet raged about something new every day, that by next week everyone would have forgotten this, that they ran this town and decided what happened inside their jurisdiction, no matter what outsiders thought. Holt's confidence came from decades of isolation, from knowing that state officials owed him favors, from believing his connections protected him from consequences. He pointed out that Ava was in their jail, subject to their laws, and would be processed according to their own timeline. They agreed to hold her for the maximum 72 hours permitted without formal charges, using every procedural delay available. If she became a problem, they could always add new charges. If she filed a complaint, they could claim she was uncooperative. If anyone questioned them, they would say they were conducting a thorough investigation. Holt called Judge Dennis Harlan, who had served on the county court for nearly 2 decades and owed his position to Holt's political machine. Harlan immediately agreed to deny Ava bail if she requested it, citing flight risk and the seriousness of the charges, and to do whatever was necessary to support law enforcement. While Millbrook's leadership congratulated itself on what it believed was a solid plan, the response gathering against them grew exponentially. Ava's former colleagues across every branch of the military were making calls, sending encrypted messages, activating networks built over decades of service. 12 active duty generals, 4 admirals, and 200 senior officers were demanding answers through their chains of command, asking how one of their own could be arrested and held without military notification. The Pentagon press secretary faced a media siege unlike anything seen in years, with reporters demanding statements, explanations, and accountability. National civil rights organizations, including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Southern Poverty Law Center, were organizing rapid response teams and preparing to head to Millbrook. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement calling Ava's arrest a clear violation of constitutional rights and demanding immediate federal intervention. Social media campaigns organized protests planned for Millbrook within the next 48 hours. Veterans groups expressed outrage that a decorated combat officer was being treated like a criminal. The story dominated news cycles, displacing other headlines and becoming the kind of viral moment that forces a national reckoning with systemic racism in law enforcement. Exactly 4 hours after Ava's arrest, 3 black government-plated SUVs arrived at the Millbrook Police Department and parked in the visitor spaces near the main entrance. 8 federal agents in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, moving with the precise coordination of professionals who had executed many similar operations. The lead agent, Special Agent Raj Patel of the FBI and a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, walked through the police station doors carrying a leather briefcase and an expression of absolute authority. Sergeant Torres looked up from her desk, confused by this sudden federal presence. Agent Patel presented his credentials, a gold badge and identification marking him as a high-level investigator with jurisdiction that superseded local authority. He removed from his briefcase a court order signed by a United States District Court judge less than an hour earlier, demanding the immediate release of Ava Sinclair into federal protective custody pending a civil rights investigation. He handed the order to Torres and instructed her to notify Chief Briggs at once. Torres, nervous and uncertain, called Briggs's office. Briggs appeared in the lobby moments later, read the order, and refused to comply, claiming that local jurisdiction superseded federal authority in cases of local criminal violations. Patel, who had heard that argument many times in small towns across the country, responded with calm precision that the Federal Civil Rights Act establishes absolute federal jurisdiction when state actors violate constitutional rights. Under the authority of that statute, he informed Briggs that the United States Marshals Service had already been notified and was en route with the authority to take Ava Sinclair into custody by force if necessary, and that obstructing federal officers in the performance of their duties carried a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Briggs's face reddened, yet he held his ground, telling Patel that this was his station, his town, and his arrest, and that no federal agent was going to walk in and tell him how to run his department. Briggs barricaded himself in his office along with Officer Langford and 2 other officers, Davis and Coleman, refusing to allow federal agents into the cell block where Ava was being held. The standoff began not with violence but with stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality, with Briggs believing his defiance would be supported by the community and that federal agents would not risk a confrontation inside a small-town police station. Mayor Holt arrived minutes after being notified, emboldened by a crowd of local supporters who had gathered outside after word spread through town that federal agents were trying to override local authority. He brushed past Agent Patel and his team, entering Briggs's office without knocking and positioning himself as the ultimate authority in Millbrook. Holt told Patel that Millbrook would not be intimidated by the federal government, that they had rights as a municipality, that outside agitators and federal overreach had no place in their community. His language deliberately evoked the rhetoric of another era, of resistance to civil rights enforcement in the 1960s, of the belief that states and localities should control their own affairs without interference. Outside, A crowd of about 60 white residents had gathered on the sidewalk and in the parking lot, some openly carrying firearms as permitted by Georgia law, demonstrating their support for Briggs and their rejection of federal intervention. They shouted about states' rights and local control, holding signs that read, "Support our police," and "Federal tyranny stops here." Several wore clothing with Confederate imagery. The energy of the crowd was one of anger and defensiveness, a community that felt attacked by outsiders who did not understand their way of life. Agent Patel, standing in the station lobby with his team, called his superior at FBI headquarters in Washington and provided a situation update. 20 minutes later, 3 United States Marshal Service vehicles arrived with a total of 12 deputy marshals in tactical gear. The Marshal Service, the oldest federal law enforcement agency and the one with authority to execute federal court orders, took positions around the building. The standoff drew live news coverage from every national network. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and Atlanta's local stations set up satellite trucks across the street from the station, broadcasting live images of the tense scene. Legal experts appeared on screen to explain that federal jurisdiction is absolute in civil rights cases, that local police have no authority to challenge federal orders, and that this confrontation could not end well for Millbrook's leadership. Briggs, watching the news coverage on the television in his office, issued a statement through an attorney claiming that Ava had never properly proven her identity, that his officers had acted appropriately based on the information they had, that they were conducting a thorough investigation and would not be pressured by political interests. He doubled down on every claim, every justification, every rationalization, believing his position was defensible and that Millbrook public opinion backed him. The governor of Georgia, watching the crisis from the state capitol in Atlanta, received a call from the White House chief of staff. The conversation was brief and direct. The federal government expected Georgia to intervene immediately, to order local authorities to obey federal law in order to avoid a confrontation that could escalate into violence. The governor, aware of both federal authority and the political implications of a standoff that made Georgia appear still to be fighting the Civil War, called Mayor Holt directly and ordered him to comply with federal demands. Holt insisted the governor did not understand the local situation and suggested that yielding to federal pressure would destroy law enforcement morale across the state. The governor, losing patience, told Holt he had 1 hour to release Ava Sinclair or the state police would intervene on behalf of federal authorities. Holt still refused, convinced that local sentiment and his political connections would ultimately protect him from consequences. Ava, still seated in the cell with Dorothy and the younger woman whose name she had learned was Tanisha, could hear the commotion in the building, raised voices, the movement of many people, the tension vibrating through the walls. Dorothy whispered updates based on what she could overhear from officers passing the cells. Federal agents were here. There was a standoff. News trucks were outside. Ava maintained her composure, drawing on decades of military discipline, keeping her emotions under control even as fury burned beneath the surface. She spoke quietly with her cellmates, asking about their lives, their families, their own experiences with the Millbrook police. Dorothy described being stopped 6 times in the past 2 years for trivial infractions, each stop involving searches and interrogations. Tanisha spoke of her brother, arrested 3 years earlier on drug charges that were later dismissed, but only after he spent 8 months in the county jail because he could not afford bail. The stories painted a picture of systematic harassment, of a police department that functioned as an occupying force in the black community, rather than as protectors of public safety. At 9:15 that evening, 7 hours after Ava's arrest, the Secretary of Defense appeared on national television for an emergency press conference broadcast live from the Pentagon. Standing at a podium with the American flag behind him and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at his side, the Secretary read a prepared statement in a voice that conveyed both authority and barely controlled anger. He identified Ava by her full rank and position, describing her as one of the nation's most decorated officers, a combat veteran who had served with distinction for 27 years, and the Deputy Commander of Air Combat Command, responsible for 16 aircraft, 38,000 personnel, and a critical component of United States national defense. He stated clearly that her arrest was not only an injustice against her personally, but an attack on the United States Armed Forces and on the principle that all Americans are entitled to equal protection under the law regardless of race. The Secretary announced that he was personally authorizing every federal action necessary to secure Ava's release and to ensure accountability for the mistreatment she had suffered. He revealed that the Department of Justice had opened a formal civil rights investigation into the Millbrook Police Department with full authority to examine all of its practices, policies, and personnel. He confirmed that the FBI had assumed the case immediately and that United States Marshals were on site with orders to secure Ava's release by any means necessary. The conference ended without the Secretary taking questions. He simply declared that the United States Armed Forces take care of their own, and that those who violate the rights of service members will face the full weight of federal law. The impact was immediate and overwhelming, transforming what Millbrook's leadership still wanted to believe was a local matter into a national crisis, with the full attention of the executive branch of the federal government. By midnight, Millbrook existed under what amounted to a de facto federal occupation, though no one used that term officially. 40 FBI agents had arrived from the Atlanta field office and from the Civil Rights Division headquarters in Washington. 20 United States Marshals secured the perimeter of the police station and established checkpoints on surrounding streets. A Department of Justice Civil Rights Division team, transported on a military aircraft, set up its operations center in a hotel conference room 2 blocks from City Hall. The quiet town that normally saw little activity after dark now glowed with lights, movement, and the presence of federal authority that could neither be ignored nor challenged. A federal judge, awakened from sleep and convened by telephone conference, issued an emergency order at 11:38 that night that nullified all local authority and placed Ava Sinclair under the protective custody of the United States Marshals Service. The order was explicit and forceful, leaving no room for interpretation or disobedience. United States Marshals were authorized to enter the Millbrook Police Department by force if necessary to secure Ava's release and to arrest any individual who interfered with the execution of federal orders. Chief Briggs received the order by fax at 11:45 and read it 3 times, each reading making clear that he no longer had options. Mayor Holt, still present in Briggs's office, argued for continued resistance, suggesting they could tangle everything in legal challenges for months. But Town Attorney Chambers, who had been frantically researching federal civil rights legislation for the past several hours, told them both that defying this order would result in immediate arrest and federal prosecution. She explained that the precedents were clear. Federal authority in civil rights cases is absolute. They had no legal ground on which to stand. Briggs received a final ultimatum from the Chief of the United States Marshals, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had spent 20 years executing federal court orders. Release Ava Sinclair immediately or face federal charges for obstruction of justice, contempt of court, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Officer Langford, who had been sitting silently in Briggs's office while the symbolic walls closed around them, suddenly panicked as he grasped the magnitude of what he had done. He asked Briggs what they should do, his voice cracking with fear. But Briggs no longer had answers. At 2:47 in the morning, 8 hours and 37 minutes after Ava's arrest, United States Marshals physically removed the barricaded door of the cell block using a battering ram they had brought specifically for this purpose. They advanced down the hallway with experienced efficiency, locating Ava in the 3rd cell. Marshal Vance identified herself, showed Ava the court order, and opened the cell personally. Ava stood, nodded to Dorothy and Tanisha, and walked out with her head high and the impeccable posture of a military officer, despite 8 hours of illegal detention. FBI agents immediately began seizing all police department records, computers, and evidence under the authority of the federal investigation. They packed files into boxes, cloned hard drives, photographed every detail of Briggs's office, and cataloged proof that would be used in subsequent prosecutions. What they discovered in those first hours surprised even the most experienced civil rights investigators. Briggs's office contained files documenting years of racial profiling, with handwritten notes describing surveillance strategies, specifically targeting the East Side neighborhoods. Arrest records revealed that black residents were detained at a rate 4 times higher than white residents for identical infractions. Traffic stop data showed that black drivers were searched 7 times more often than white drivers, even though contraband was found more frequently in vehicles driven by white motorists. Financial records revealed that Briggs and several other officers received quarterly bonuses based on total arrest numbers, creating a perverse incentive to maximize detentions regardless of actual criminal activity. The system had been designed deliberately and explicitly to direct its efforts against the black community for purposes of revenue generation and social control. Ava was escorted to a federal facility, actually a Georgia Bureau of Investigation office 30 miles away, for medical evaluation and documentation. A physician photographed the bruises on her wrists where the handcuffs had torn the skin, the contusions on her arms where Langford had gripped her roughly, the abrasions on her back caused by being slammed against the car. Every injury was documented, measured, and recorded as evidence. Federal prosecutors would use these photographs in the criminal trials. Ava gave an initial statement describing the arrest, Langford's behavior, the clear racial animus in his words and actions, and the systematic denial of her rights. She spoke with calm precision, providing the kind of detailed testimony prosecutors dream of. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, Mayor Holt organized a defiant public meeting the following morning at 9 o'clock. 200 people attended, the majority white, the majority supporting the police and opposing federal intervention. Holt framed the situation as federal overreach, as an attack on small-town values, as outsiders imposing their will on a community that should be free to govern itself. He portrayed Briggs and Langford as victims of political correctness, of a rush to judgment, of a federal government that cared more about appearances than about truth. The crowd applauded, some standing, others shouting their support. Several speakers took the microphone to defend the police, to claim that the black community was playing the victim, to suggest that Ava had somehow provoked her own arrest. The rhetoric was ugly and revealing, exposing the racial attitudes that had governed Millbrook for generations. During the public meeting, while Holt stood at the podium receiving applause, FBI agents walked through the doors of the community center where the gathering was being held. They carried arrest warrants issued by a federal grand jury convened overnight in an emergency session. Agent Patel walked to the front of the room, displayed his credentials, and announced that he had arrest warrants for Chief Raymond Briggs and Officer Travis Langford. The charges were read aloud so everyone could hear. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony carrying up to 10 years in prison. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights, another 10 years. False arrest and unlawful detention, up to 5 years. And for Langford specifically, assault under color of law, up to 8 years. Briggs and Langford, both present at the public meeting, were detained in front of the crowd. They were handcuffed, read their Miranda rights, and escorted to federal vehicles while residents shouted and cameras recorded everything. Mayor Holt was not arrested, but Agent Patel publicly informed him that he was under investigation for conspiracy and corruption, that federal agents would examine all city financial records, and that he should retain legal counsel immediately. The public meeting erupted into chaos. Some shouted at the FBI agents. Others sat in stunned silence. A few looked quietly satisfied that accountability had finally arrived in Millbrook. Over the following 72 hours, the federal investigation expanded far beyond Ava's arrest to examine every aspect of Millbrook's policing system, its practices, its culture, and its systematic harassment of black residents. A Department of Justice team interviewed 83 black residents who had experienced harassment, false arrests, excessive force, or other civil rights violations over the previous decade. Each interview was recorded, transcribed, and added to a growing file that documented not isolated incidents, but a pattern and practice of discrimination. The stories that emerged painted a devastating picture of life in Millbrook for anyone with dark skin. A black teacher named Robert Matthews was arrested for suspicious behavior while collecting mail from his own mailbox in front of his own house. Officers claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect. They held him for 6 hours and released him without charges after his white neighbors confirmed he lived there. A black business owner named Patricia Holmes was arrested for trespassing in her own clothing store after a white customer called the police claiming she was being aggressive, which meant Patricia had asked her not to let her children run unsupervised through the store. Patricia spent the night in jail and had to hire a lawyer to have the charges dismissed. An elderly black man named James Crawford was stopped 47 times in 3 years, always for minor infractions such as a broken taillight or failure to signal. Each time his vehicle was searched. Each time he was released with a warning but no ticket, the harassment itself being the punishment. A black teenager named Julian Henderson was arrested at school for disorderly conduct after questioning a white teacher's claim that slavery had not really been that bad. He was handcuffed in front of his classmates, taken to the station, and charged with disrupting the educational environment. Forensic accountants, specializing in uncovering fraud and embezzlement, discovered that Chief Briggs had diverted $78,000 from the police budget over 5 years. The money was supposed to fund community outreach programs and training, but had been transferred into accounts controlled by Briggs and used for personal expenses including a boat, a vacation property, and gambling debts. The theft was poorly concealed, suggesting Briggs never believed he would face consequences. Officer Langford's personnel file revealed 12 prior complaints of excessive force during his 8 years on the department. All involved black citizens. All were dismissed by Briggs without investigation. One complaint described Langford breaking a man's arm during a traffic stop. Another recounted him using pepper spray on a woman holding a baby. A third described him planting evidence during a search. Each complaint was cataloged as unfounded or uncorroborated, filed away and forgotten by everyone except the victims, who learned that complaining about police misconduct in Millbrook was useless. Town Attorney Jessica Chambers, sensing which way the situation was leaning and hoping to save herself from criminal prosecution, began cooperating discreetly with federal investigators. She provided internal documents showing she had warned Mayor Holt and Chief Briggs multiple times about civil rights violations, that she had informed them the department's practices were illegal, that she had recommended reforms and training that were ignored. She produced emails, memoranda, and meeting notes documenting her warnings. She revealed that Holt had ordered her on multiple occasions to bury complaints, threaten victims with retaliatory lawsuits if they pursued legal action, and use town resources to intimidate anyone who challenged police authority. Her cooperation gave prosecutors direct evidence of conspiracy and cover-up at the highest levels of Millbrook government. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, called in to examine possible state law violations, discovered that Judge Dennis Harlan had for years approved illegal search warrants, authorizing searches based on insufficient probable cause, denying bail unfairly on racial grounds, and sentencing black defendants more severely than white defendants for identical offenses. Statistical analysis of his judicial decisions revealed bias so extreme and consistent that it could only be deliberate. Harlan had presided over a system that funneled black residents into the criminal justice system while treating white residents with leniency and the benefit of the doubt. National civil rights attorneys arrived in Millbrook within days of Ava's release, setting up a temporary legal clinic in the basement of Mercy Baptist Church to offer free representation to victims. The church basement, where Ava's mother had taught Sunday school for 30 years, became a center of justice and accountability. 47 residents filed federal civil rights lawsuits against the Millbrook Police Department, individual officers, Mayor Holt, and the town itself. The lawsuits sought compensation for false arrest, emotional distress, and violation of constitutional rights. They also requested punitive damages designed to punish and deter future misconduct. Collective liability could reach tens of millions of dollars. Ava traveled to Washington to give a detailed statement in the federal case. Over 8 hours she described every moment of her arrest, every word spoken, every action taken. She detailed the clear racial animus in Langford's behavior, his immediate assumption that she was a criminal based solely on the color of her skin, his refusal to see her as anything other than a threat despite overwhelming evidence of her identity and position. She described the psychological impact of being treated as less than human, of watching decades of service nullified, of being brutalized while mourning her mother. Her testimony was powerful, articulate, and devastating. It would be used not only in the criminal prosecutions but also as evidence in the broader pattern and practice investigation. Media coverage intensified with investigative reports examining systemic racism in small-town police departments across America. Major newspapers sent reporters to Millbrook to document how a town of 12,000 inhabitants maintained an effectively segregated society enforced through police power. Documentaries were commissioned. Academic researchers arrived to study the case. Ava's arrest became a catalyst for national conversations about qualified immunity, police accountability, federal oversight, and the persistence of racial injustice in American law enforcement. The FBI discovered text messages between Briggs, Langford, and 5 other officers containing openly racist language that eliminated any remaining doubt about their motivations and beliefs. The messages spanned 3 years and included racial slurs, jokes about chasing black residents, and celebrations of arrests that kept their numbers high. One message from Briggs to his officers read, "Keep the numbers high on the east side," referring specifically to the predominantly black neighborhood where he wanted maximum enforcement. Another message from Langford, sent only minutes after Ava's arrest, said, "Got another one. They're making it too easy," accompanied by laughing emojis. The messages were leaked to the press by someone inside the investigation, provoking national outrage and destroying any public support the officers might have retained outside Millbrook. Even some white residents who had initially supported Briggs and Langford began distancing themselves when confronted with explicit evidence of racism rather than plausible deniability. 2 weeks after Ava's arrest, the federal government delivered its final assessment in a devastating 73-page report, documenting systematic civil rights violations and concluding that the Millbrook Police Department must be completely dissolved. The Department of Justice filed a consent decree in federal court requiring the total dismantling of the department, a remedy reserved only for the most corrupt and dysfunctional law enforcement agencies. All 12 officers were placed on administrative leave, while individual investigations proceeded into their conduct, their knowledge of discriminatory practices, and their personal participation in civil rights violations. 7 officers, including Desk Sergeant Helen Torres, and officers Kyle Hendricks and Travis Morton, were declared active participants in the pattern of discrimination. They faced federal criminal charges and permanent bans from working in any law enforcement agency in the United States. The charges varied by officer and specific actions, but all involved deprivation of rights under color of law, and all carried substantial prison sentences. The remaining 5 officers were cleared of criminal liability, but informed that they must complete exhaustive federal civil rights training and pass rigorous psychological evaluations before they could ever work in policing again. Their careers in Millbrook were finished either way. Mayor Gerald Holt was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on 14 counts, including conspiracy to deprive civil rights, obstruction of justice, public corruption, wire fraud, and embezzlement of funds. The evidence presented to the grand jury showed that Holt had personally ordered the harassment of black community leaders who opposed his administration, that he had directed police to arrest specific individuals, that he had used town resources for personal benefit, and that he had conspired to cover up civil rights violations when complaints were filed. His bail was set at $500,000. His attorneys immediately began negotiating a plea agreement, but federal prosecutors were not interested in offering leniency. Judge Dennis Harlan, removed from the bench by order of the Georgia Supreme Court after the State Judicial Qualifications Commission concluded he had violated ethical rules and demonstrated bias that undermined public confidence in the judiciary, was disbarred, permanently lost his law license, and faced possible federal charges for his role in the systematic denial of rights. His removal meant that dozens of cases over which he had presided would be reviewed for possible wrongful convictions. The Georgia State Patrol assumed law enforcement responsibilities in Millbrook during the transition period while a new department was created from scratch. State troopers patrolled the streets, answered calls, and operated under strict federal supervision to ensure civil rights compliance. The presence of state police rather than local officers immediately changed the dynamic. Black residents reported feeling safer, less harassed, less terrified. Routine interactions with police no longer carried the threat of arbitrary arrest or violence. Ava returned to Millbrook for a community meeting at Mercy Baptist Church 3 weeks after her arrest. The meeting was publicly announced and 300 people attended, the great majority black, though several dozen white residents also came to hear what she had to say. Ava spoke for 45 minutes without notes, describing her experience, the broader investigation, and what she hoped would emerge from this tragedy. She spoke of her mother, of growing up in Millbrook, of leaving for the Air Force as a determined young woman intent on serving her country, and of returning to bury her mother only to be treated as a criminal. She spoke of justice, of accountability, and of the absolute necessity of systemic change. She explained that this was not about punishing a single bad officer, but about dismantling structures of oppression that had persisted for generations. She called on white residents to examine their complicity, to recognize that the police behavior they had dismissed or ignored generated terror for their black neighbors. She challenged everyone to build something better, to create a Millbrook where all residents were truly equal before the law. Many in the audience shared their own stories of harassment, abuse, and discrimination. A pattern of decades of mistreatment emerged, of fear passed from parents to children, of a community traumatized by the very institution that was supposed to protect it. Ava listened to every story, validated every experience, and promised that the federal government would provide resources for counseling and emotional support. She announced that she personally was creating a legal defense fund to support victims of police misconduct in Millbrook and across the country, seeding it with $100,000 of her own money. She also revealed that the Air Force was creating a new civil rights liaison program that would carry the name Lauren Wright Initiative in honor of her mother, designed to connect military personnel with resources if they experienced discrimination. White residents who supported Briggs held counter-protests on the courthouse lawn during Ava's speech, though they were heavily outnumbered, and their message crumbled under the overwhelming evidence of systematic racism. Their signs claimed they were the true victims, that their town was being destroyed by outsiders, that political correctness had gone too far. Some local businesses displayed signs supporting Briggs and Langford, prompting organized boycotts by black residents and their allies. The economic consequences of being on the wrong side of history became evident quickly. During Ava's speech at Mercy Baptist Church, while she spoke about the importance of accountability and justice, a black girl made her way to the front of the sanctuary. The girl was about 8 years old. She wore a pink dress and her hair in braids tied with ribbons. She approached the microphone with the help of her grandmother, her small hands gripping the stand as she looked at the crowd with tears running down her face. Her name was Kennedy Jameson. In a voice that trembled but did not break, Kennedy explained that Officer Travis Langford had arrested her father 2 years earlier on drug charges that everyone knew were false. Her father, Marcus James, had a small auto repair shop on the west side of town where he fixed cars for fair prices and treated every customer with respect. Langford had stopped him one afternoon for a broken taillight that was not actually broken, searched his truck, and claimed to have found methamphetamine under the driver's seat. Marcus insisted he had been framed, that the drugs had been planted, but no one believed him because Langford was a police officer and Marcus was a black man with a 20-year-old marijuana possession arrest. Marcus spent 18 months in the county jail awaiting trial because he could not afford the $50,000 bail. His auto shop closed. His reputation was destroyed. His family struggled financially and emotionally. Then, 3 weeks before trial, another officer came forward admitting that Langford had bragged about planting evidence, and that the department's drug testing procedures were so careless that chain of custody for the alleged methamphetamine could not be established. The charges were quietly dismissed, but by then Marcus had already lost everything. The federal investigation had now fully exonerated him, finding explicit evidence that Langford had planted the drugs and falsified the police report. Langford faced additional charges for evidence tampering, perjury, and conspiracy. Marcus was in the process of having his record expunged and would receive compensation from the Victim Compensation Fund being created. Kennedy, her voice now steadier, thanked Ava for being brave, for standing up to people who thought they could do whatever they wanted to black people without facing consequences. She said Ava had saved her daddy by refusing to stay silent, by fighting even when it would have been easier to accept the injustice. The church erupted in emotionally charged applause. People stood, crying, the weight of decades of pain and the hope of justice finally arriving flooding the space. Ava, normally stoic and controlled, wept openly as she embraced Kennedy. The image of a three-star general hugging a little girl became the defining photograph of the Millbrook crisis, published on newspaper front pages across the United States. 6 months after Ava's arrest, the federal criminal trials began in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia in Atlanta. The prosecutions were swift, methodical, and devastating for the defendants. Officer Travis Langford was tried first, facing the most serious charges and the greatest public scrutiny. The trial lasted 2 weeks and drew national media coverage. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including the viral video of Ava's arrest, Ava's testimony delivered with calm authority, medical reports documenting her injuries, the text messages revealing Langford's racist attitudes, and the testimony of other victims describing his pattern of abuse and evidence planting. Langford's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender doing what he could with an impossible case, argued that Langford believed he was doing his job, that he made a judgment error but did not intend to violate anyone's rights, that the situation got out of control. The argument failed completely because intent is not a requirement for conviction under federal civil rights statutes, only that the defendant deprives someone of constitutional rights while acting under color of law. The jury, composed of 7 women and 5 men of various races from the Atlanta metropolitan area, deliberated exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing 3 weeks later, federal Judge Sharon Mitchell, an African-American woman who had presided over civil rights cases for 15 years, delivered a scorching statement. She described Langford's actions as an abuse of power that struck at the heart of American democracy, noting that police officers are given extraordinary authority and must be held to the highest standard when they violate that trust. She sentenced Langford to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, at the high end of the sentencing guidelines, explaining that the penalty reflected both the severity of his crimes and the need to send a message that such conduct would not be tolerated. Langford showed no emotion as he was led away in shackles. Chief Raymond Briggs's trial followed, lasting 3 weeks and involving an even greater volume of evidence. Prosecutors presented the systematic pattern of discrimination under Briggs's leadership, the embezzlement of funds, the cover-up of complaints, and the testimony of 23 victims who described harassment, false arrests, and intimidation. Briggs's defense attempted to argue that he was simply following established practices, that other departments across the country operated similarly, that he was being made a scapegoat for broader social problems. The jury rejected these arguments entirely and found Briggs guilty on 18 counts. At sentencing, victim impact statements occupied an entire day as person after person described how Briggs's leadership created a climate of fear and oppression in Millbrook's black community. Judge Mitchell sentenced Briggs to 22 years in federal prison, noting that his position of authority and his deliberate construction of a discriminatory system justified severe punishment. Briggs, unlike Langford, attempted to speak during sentencing, claiming he never intended to cause harm and that he always believed he was protecting the community. Judge Mitchell interrupted him to say that the intent to cause harm was not the issue, that his actions caused immense harm regardless of his stated intentions, and that his lack of remorse even now demonstrated why a lengthy sentence was necessary. Mayor Gerald Holt pleaded guilty to avoid trial. His plea agreement required full cooperation with federal investigators, testimony against other potentially corrupt officials in county government, and acceptance of a 12-year sentence. At his plea hearing, Holt made a statement expressing regret, though his words sounded hollow and self-serving. He was sent to a federal prison in South Carolina, far from Millbrook and the power he once wielded. Judge Dennis Harlan accepted a deal resulting in a 5-year sentence and permanent disbarment, along with an agreement to cooperate in the review of possible wrongful convictions in cases over which he had presided. His fall from respected jurist to convicted felon was complete and humiliating. The other 7 officers received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years depending on their level of participation in the discriminatory practices and specific acts of misconduct. Every officer involved in Ava's arrest, or in the broader pattern of civil rights violations, faced time in federal prison and the permanent loss of any law enforcement career. The civil lawsuits filed by the victims resulted in a massive settlement negotiated between the federal government, the town of Millbrook, and the insurance companies that had covered the police department and the municipality. The total settlement reached $47 million, distributed among the victims according to the severity of their experiences and the damages suffered. Ava received $3 million, which she immediately donated to her legal defense fund and to organizations dedicated to police reform. Marcus James received $1.2 million, enough to reopen his auto repair shop and secure his family's future. Other victims received amounts ranging from $50,000 to $500,000. The settlement destroyed Millbrook's budget, forcing service cuts and tax increases that enraged residents. Insurers stopped covering Millbrook entirely, making it nearly impossible for the town to obtain future policies. The financial consequences of systemic racism became undeniable. The Georgia state legislature, pressured by national attention on Millbrook and by civil rights advocates seizing the moment, passed the Lauren Wright Police Accountability Act. The law requires all Georgia police agencies to collect and report demographic data on stops, searches, and arrests. It mandates implicit bias and de-escalation training. It creates a state oversight board with authority to investigate complaints and decertify officers who violate civil rights. It limits qualified immunity for officers who act in bad faith or with gross negligence. The law is comprehensive and represents the most significant police reform in Georgia's history. Congress held hearings on police accountability and civil rights enforcement, inviting Ava to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. She appeared in her Air Force uniform, her 3 stars gleaming under the committee room lights, and offered testimony watched by millions. She described her arrest not as an isolated incident, but as an example of what countless Black Americans experience regularly without the benefit of military rank or national attention. She stated that federal standards for police training are needed, along with a national registry of officers fired for misconduct to prevent them from simply moving to another department. She argued that federal intervention is necessary when agencies fail to address civil rights violations. She maintained that reform is not anti-police but pro-justice, that good officers suffer when bad ones are protected, that accountability strengthens rather than weakens law enforcement. Her testimony was praised by senators of both parties and became a rallying point for reform advocates throughout the hearings. The Department of Justice revealed something surprising discovered during the Millbrook investigation and subsequent follow-up work. Millbrook was not an isolated case but part of a broader pattern. Federal investigators had identified 37 other small-town police departments across 2 states with remarkably similar patterns of racial discrimination, excessive force, and systematic civil rights violations. The departments were scattered across the South and Midwest, all in cities with significant Black populations, all operating with minimal or no oversight. The revelation made clear that Millbrook was not an anomaly, but a widespread problem that had persisted for decades outside national attention. The federal government announced a nationwide initiative to audit local police agencies, with mandatory reforms or dissolution for those found in systematic violation of civil rights. The initiative, unprecedented in scope, represented the largest federal intervention in local policing since the civil rights era. Ava's arrest, which began as a personal tragedy and injustice, had ignited the broadest police accountability movement of the past 50 years. 1 year after her arrest, Ava stood again in Millbrook, but the town to which she returned had changed in ways both visible and profound. The old police department building, that brick structure with peeling paint where she had been held for 9 hours, had been transformed into a community center and civil rights museum. The transformation was both symbolic and practical, converting a site of oppression into a space of education and healing. The museum's first exhibit, occupying the entire lower floor, documented Ava's arrest and the subsequent federal investigation through photographs, videos, court documents, and personal testimonies. Visitors could watch the viral video that sparked national outrage. They could read the racist text messages that revealed the officer's true beliefs. They could see the bruises on Ava's wrists and arms. They could understand what happened in Millbrook and why it matters. The museum included a broader exhibit on police brutality and racial justice in the United States, placing Millbrook's story within historical context. Millbrook now had a new police department created from scratch under federal and state supervision. The department employed 15 officers, all rigorously screened and required to complete extensive training in civil rights, de-escalation, and community policing. The new police chief was Captain Sharon Reynolds, a black woman with 20 years of law enforcement experience, a master's degree in criminal justice, and an impeccable record of professional conduct and community commitment. Chief Reynolds had made building trust with black residents her highest priority, organizing community forums, walking the neighborhoods, listening to concerns, and demonstrating through actions that this department existed to serve everyone equally. The racial climate in Millbrook had changed dramatically, though not without resistance and difficulty. Black residents reported feeling safer walking the streets without fearing arbitrary stops or harassment. Traffic stops were recorded on body cameras regularly reviewed for any sign of bias. Arrests were documented and tracked to ensure no patterns of discrimination emerged. The changes were real and measurable. Some white residents had adapted to the new reality, recognizing that the old system was unjust and supporting reform. Others remained resentful, viewing the changes as punishment for the entire community rather than accountability for specific acts. A few dozen white families had left Millbrook entirely, unable or unwilling to live in a town where they could no longer rely on the police to maintain racial hierarchies. Their departure slightly altered Millbrook's demographics, and new families, both black and white, had moved in, drawn by lower housing costs and the promise of genuine equality. Ava attended the museum's opening ceremony on a bright October Saturday morning. She was accompanied by General Thomas Reeves and the Secretary of Defense, demonstrating continued federal attention and support. 3 sitting United States senators attended along with the governor of Georgia and numerous state legislators. The ceremony drew more than 500 people, filling the museum and spilling onto the lawn outside. Local and national media covered the event extensively. During the ceremony, Ava spoke of her mother, Lauren Sinclair, whose funeral had been interrupted by injustice, but whose legacy now included a movement of accountability and reform. Ava described her mother as a woman who believed in education, dignity, and the possibility of change even in the face of deeply rooted racism. She said her mother had taught her to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult or dangerous, never to accept injustice as inevitable, and to believe in humanity's capacity to grow and redeem itself. Ava revealed that she would retire from the Air Force in 6 months after 28 years of distinguished service to work full-time on police reform and civil rights advocacy. She had been promoted to Lieutenant General, receiving her 4th star in a ceremony at the Pentagon 3 months earlier. But she felt called to dedicate the next stage of her life to the work that had emerged from her arrest. She was launching a national foundation called the Lauren Wright Initiative for Justice and Accountability. The foundation would provide legal support to victims of police misconduct, advocate for federal oversight and reform legislation, fund community organizing efforts to demand accountability, and support research into effective policing strategies that protect both public safety and civil rights. The foundation had already raised $12 million from donors across the country who were moved by Ava's story and wanted to support systemic change. Marcus James spoke during the ceremony, standing beside his daughter Kennedy, now 9 years old and displaying a confidence she had not possessed a year earlier. Marcus thanked Ava for her courage and for refusing to let injustice go unanswered. He announced that he had reopened his auto repair shop under a new name, Wright's Auto Repair, in honor of Ava's mother and the justice that had finally come to Millbrook. His business was thriving, supported by customers who valued both his skill and his story. Kennedy handed Ava a drawing she had made showing Ava in her Air Force uniform with angel wings outstretched. The inscription at the bottom read, "General Ava, our hero, our angel, our hope. The image was simple yet powerful in the perspective of a child who understood that heroes are people who stand up for others even when it costs them. Ava accepted the drawing with tears in her eyes, embracing Kennedy tightly while photographers captured a moment that would be shared millions of times on social media. When the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, eating food provided by Black-owned restaurants and discussing the changes in Millbrook, an elderly white man approached Ava cautiously. He introduced himself as Robert Langford, 74 years old, father of Travis Langford, who was now serving a 15-year sentence in a federal prison. Ava tensed instinctively, uncertain of his intentions, aware that this moment was being observed by the security personnel and federal agents who had accompanied her. Robert's eyes were red from crying. His hands trembled slightly and his voice broke as he spoke. He told Ava that his son had been wrong, that the arrest had been wrong, that the racism had been wrong, and that he, Robert, bore responsibility for raising his son with the attitudes and beliefs that led to so much cruelty. Robert said he had taught his son to see black people as threats, to regard his badge as a license to dominate rather than to serve, to prioritize maintaining a racial hierarchy above justice. He said he was ashamed not only of his son, but of himself, of Millbrook, of all the people who remained silent while their black neighbors suffered. He had come to apologize without expecting forgiveness, but needing to acknowledge the harm caused and his role in creating the person who caused it. He extended a trembling hand, waiting to see if Ava would take it. Ava paused, the weight of the moment pressing upon her, aware that her response would be interpreted, analyzed, and remembered. She thought of her mother, of the teachings of Mercy Baptist Church, of the difference between justice and vengeance, of what true accountability requires. She took Robert's hand, holding it firmly, and told him that change does not arise from hatred or vengeance, but from responsibility, from learning, and from choosing each day a different path forward. She told him that his son would serve his sentence and face the consequences of his actions, but that Robert could still choose to be different, to raise his voice against racism, to work for the kind of Millbrook where no one is targeted or harmed because of the color of their skin. Robert, tears running down his weathered face, thanked her again and again. The moment was captured by photographers and became the defining image of the day, published on front pages and shared on social media with captions about reconciliation and hope. The photograph showed a black woman in military uniform and an elderly white man with their hands clasped, representing the painful but necessary path toward justice and healing. Ava looked around at the museum, at the gathered community, at the new police force standing respectfully on the perimeter, at black children playing without fear, and she knew her mother would be proud. Justice had taken time, demanded sacrifices, and required unwavering courage from her and from the many people who supported the investigation and fought for accountability. But it had arrived. From the arrest of a woman during a funeral had risen a movement that changed the way America thinks about police accountability, that led to reforms in multiple states, that demonstrated that no one, regardless of power or position, is above the law when they violate human dignity and civil rights. The struggle continues, because systemic racism does not disappear with a single investigation or a single set of prosecutions. But today in Millbrook, Georgia, standing in a museum built where a corrupt police station once stood, surrounded by people who refuse to accept injustice as normal, Ava knows that progress is possible when people demand it and refuse to retreat. She thinks of all the victims who shared their stories, of the federal agents who pursued justice relentlessly, of the prosecutors and judges who enforced the law, of the community members who organized, protested, and insisted on change. She thinks of Kennedy Jameson and of children like her growing up in a Millbrook where the police exist to protect rather than to oppress. The future is not guaranteed, and vigilance will always be necessary. But the foundation for something better, something more just, something closer to the America that claims to guarantee equal protection under the law for all its citizens, has already been built. Ava closed her eyes briefly, feeling the October sun on her face, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for her mother's life and legacy, for the strength to endure injustice, and for the community that transformed pain into power and rage into action. What creates lasting change? What do you believe must happen to ensure that police departments across the United States truly serve and protect all communities equally, regardless of race? Have you or someone you know experienced discrimination from those sworn to protect? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America. Share this story with those who need to understand that accountability is possible when people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of the movement toward a more just society. May we all have the courage to stand for what is right, even when it costs us something. And may we build communities where everyone is treated with true dignity and equal protection under the law.